So welcome back, everyone. Thank you again for all our presented in the first session. And now we will start with our 3 dedicated sessions. Each session will provide an outline to the content of the regulation and of the immediate actions needed to transition from the current situation, as well as an overview of timelines, actions needed to implement additional tasks, and activities under EMA's extended mandate. So we're now focusing on the EMA mandate. And our first session will address EMA's responsibilities in monitoring and mitigating shortages of medicines and devices. The session will be co-chaired by Monica Diaz, who's head of supply and availability of medicines and devices workstream at EMA, and Karl Broich, head of the BfArM from Germany, and who has been recently appointed as co-chair of the Executive Steering Group on Shortages and Safety of Medicines of Medicinal Products, also referred to as Medicines Shortages Steering Group, Mssg, which is established by this new legislation. So, Monica and Karl, I hand the floor over to you for session 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Fergus. So it is a pleasure to welcome everyone to the session and to my co-chair as well, Karl Broich. Unfortunately, we cannot hear him. I would like to start by explaining the focus of this session, which will be 3 areas. So first will be the monitoring and mitigation of shortages of critical medicinal products, as well as management of major events. Then we'll move on to the setting up maintenance and management of European shortages monitoring platform that was already referred to by the previous speakers, the SMP. And then we will finalize with the monitoring and mitigation of shortages of critical medical devices. So I would like now to introduce João Ferreira. João is EMA's Medicines and Medical Devices Shortage Specialist, and he will take us through the content of the regulation and the immediate actions that are needed to transition from our current ad hoc structures and processes, as well as it will give us an overview of the timelines and actions needed to implement those additional tasks and activities that are foreseen under EMA's extended mandate. So I give now the floor to João. Please, over to you.
Thanks, Monica. I hope that you can hear me well, and good morning, everyone. So indeed, a very quick outline for this presentation, if we can move to the next slide. So indeed, first, the plan is basically to go about how actually shortages are managed in the EU. So here we'll also explain why the COVID-19 pandemic was indeed the tipping point for the setup of the new structures and also processes to manage shortages of medicines and devices during, but also in preparedness for crisis management situations. Second, we'll bring to you what are basically the key milestones for the implementation of medicines and devices shortage regulation, just before we guide you through the roles of the 2 new executive groups that are foreseen in the legislation and that are linked to the monitoring and mitigating of medicines and devices shortages. And most importantly, what are the main actions that the agency is basically going to look at in the course of 2022 to implement the new tasks. Finally, before we conclude, we'll also highlight to you what is the new European medicine shortage platform and also what is being asked to the EMA for its delivery. So if we can move to the next slide, I wanted to start by giving you also a bit of context on how regulatory authorities also manage shortage in Europe. So indeed, shortages of medicines are a growing issue of concern, not only in Europe, but also globally. And indeed, shortages can occur for several reasons, such as, for example, manufacturing difficulties or problems affecting the quality of medicines. But also shortages, they can occur linked to increased demand for medicines, just like it happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, where a surge in demand actually was experienced primarily for medicines that were used in hospital intensive care units. So one important element that we have to highlight is that indeed in the EU, most medicine shortages are actually dealt with at national level by the national competent authorities, and also marketing authorization holders. They are already required by the EU legislation to inform regulators in the event of supply disruptions that can lead to shortage or market cessation. So indeed, improving the availability of medicines has been a key priority for the EU medicines regulatory network, and actually since 2016, a task force that was set up by the EMA and also by the heads of medicines agencies in Europe has been looking at availability issues for medicines that are authorized but not marketed in order to improve the continuity supply of human and vet medicines across Europe. So really by bringing experts from the EU member states, the work of this task force actually laid the foundations for an improved EU approach in addressing medicines availability issues also during the pandemic. So if we can move to the next slide. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, indeed, the EMA went beyond its initial legal remit and actually has been asked to take on a role to coordinate actively the work of the member states on shortage prevention and also management actions. So basically, in this front, the agency has initiated a number of activities. The first one being the setup of the EU Executive Steering Group on shortages caused by major events that was actually created to provide strategic leadership for urgent and coordinated actions in order to address supply disruptions within the EU during the pandemic. The same group also set up in April 2020, in collaboration with pharmaceutical companies, a monitoring system to help mitigate supply issues for a subset of medicines to treat COVID-19 patients, the so-called ICE-POC system. Also, in the context of COVID-19, the EMA also engaged with shortage single points of contacts in the EU and the national competent authorities in order to continuously share information between the EMA, the member states, and the Commission about critical medicine shortages. Finally, the agency also together with the member states developed a common framework for forecasting demand data in the EU and in the EA to improve the forecasting of demand of medicines used in ICUs and also primarily to better match the estimated demand with the available supply. This brings me now to the new legal framework for the new EMA role in shortage management. So in the next slide, we will reflect much of the processes that actually the EMA has to put in place for the new regulation. So the new mandate actually strengthens the current role of the EMA when it comes to shortage of medicines and also crisis management. And here a completely new role in managing medical devices shortages. As we've mentioned today already several times, the regulation became applicable on the 1st of March for shortages of medicinal products. However, the provisions for the shortages of critical medical devices actually will only begin to apply as of 2nd of February 2023. So in this slide, we have basically a series of mandate milestones, and amongst the main important ones, we have first, the establishing of a list of main therapeutic groups of primarily hospital care use that will help to identify critical medicines for crisis situations, and this has to be set up by the 2nd of August this year. The agency also has to update its own IT processes and also tools to allow marketing authorization holders to appoint industry single points of contact for all the human product portfolio. So this is something that has to be done according to the legislation by the 2nd of September. And finally, the agency also needs to set up and maintain the European Shortages Monitoring Platform, the SMP, by early 2025. So the agency will actually work with the medicines regulatory network and also with stakeholders to implement the regulation, and we're actually going to be giving you more details on how we will go about this implementation in more detail in the next minute. So if we could get the next slide. So amongst the main responsibilities for the EMA for monitoring and mitigating medicine shortages under the new regulation, we have first the monitoring of events, and this can include also events like medicine shortages, which might lead to a crisis situation. Second, the agency also needs to establish processes and tools for shortages reporting and also to coordinate the responses of the EU countries to shortages of critical medicines during crisis situations. And third, the agency also needs to set up a steering group that will coordinate EU actions to mitigate medicine supply issues, so the so-called EU Executive Steering Group on Shortage and Safety of Medicinal Products, the so-called Mssg. So this executive group is actually going to be supported by two supporting structures, the Industry Single Point of Contact Network and also the Medicine Shortages SPOC Working Party. And more details on the reporting obligations of these two structures will be covered in the next slides. So primarily the key benefit of the new role is actually really facilitating the setting of recommendations and coordination of measures to prevent or mitigate potential or actual shortages. So here the key goal is really to move from a reactive approach on shortage mitigation towards a more proactive approach where we can actually prevent shortages from occurring in the first place, not to impact healthcare systems and patients ultimately. So if we move now to the next slide, where we have a schematic representation of the composition of the Mssg. So this actually includes as permanent members, representatives from patients and consumers, healthcare professionals, working parties, as well as the Commission, the member states, and the EMA. Importantly, other observers can also participate and be invited to the meetings of the Mssg. This is the case of interest groups, for example, industry trade associations or representatives of patients or consumers and healthcare professionals organizations. And this will certainly allow for continuous and collaborative dialogue during crisis periods, also similar to a setup that was also initially put in place by the EMA in the beginning of the pandemic. Finally, also the regulation foresees other interactions with union agencies and also with commission services like DG HERA. So what are the main Mssg responsibilities? So in the next slide, we will be covering those. So during public health emergency or a major event, the Mssg really has or will have a dual role that should be clearly distinguished. So on the one hand, the group has a role in medicine shortages, and the main responsibilities here are establishing lists of critical medicinal products that are to be closely monitored. For public health emergencies, those lists will be developed also in consultation with the Emergency Task Force, ETF. Also, still on the shortages stream, the group also has to provide recommendations and also coordinate measures to prevent or mitigate potential or actual shortages. On the other hand, the Mssg also has a role in the area of quality, safety, and efficacy of medicinal products. And here, the Mssg has been tasked to evaluate information that is related to the public health emergency or the major event, and also provide recommendations regarding quality, safety, and efficacy of medicinal products concerned. In addition to that, the Mssg also has to provide recommendations to the Commission and to the Member States on any appropriate action that it is believed to be undertaken at union level for the products that are concerned. There will be, as I mentioned before, two main groups of single points of contact, both in the member states and industry, that will support medicine shortage reporting and primarily the support the Mssg operations. And we will now address those structures in the next slide. So the first one is the Medicine Shortages SPOC Working Party, which consists of SPOCs in the national competent authorities. Here, the working party will be quite active in preparation for health emergencies and major events, so during the so-called peacetime, as well as during public health emergencies or major events. So here, the main responsibilities are reporting of shortages in peacetime. So these are actually, for example, shortages that are critical according to predefined criteria, and also monitoring of events that can lead to shortages. Here, an example is, for example, an event like Brexit and the impact that it had on basically having a series of products at risk of supply. Another important responsibility is also the reporting of estimated data on volumes of demand. The second group is the industry SPOC network. So this concerns basically a subset of marketing authorization holders according to a list of critical medicines, which requires close monitoring. It's important to note that the list of critical medicines will be made publicly available, and that the agency will also notify the companies in scope of such concern reporting obligations. So the ISPOC network will basically be activated only during a public health emergency or major event, and I can't stress this enough. So this will only be for a pre-selected list of critical medicines. So amongst the main obligations for the ISPOC network, we have the reporting of shortages. In addition to that, a reporting of additional information like active or alternative manufacturing sites, marketing status, and also available stocks. And finally, also information to the level of forecasts of demand, as well as supply capacity. And in addition to that, also prevention and mitigation plans. So the agency will continue to also engage with stakeholders, and in order to deliver the new mandate in the next slide, I'll be telling you more about the main actions that we are looking at in 2022. So basically in April, we are now formally establishing the Medicine Shortages Steering Group and its supporting working party. So in addition to that, we'll also work on setting setting up the guidance for the reporting of shortages and also for demand and supply data from industry and NCAs. Also, in April, we are setting up the list of critical medicines for COVID-19 and also the related single points of contact from industry in order to monitor shortages of medicines that are on the critical medicines list. We will also continue monitoring events, and this is, for example, the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on the availability of medicines in the European market. So this is something that we are following quite closely at the moment. Also, the new regulation brings enhanced transparency requirements on the publication and communication of shortages information. So in the coming months, we'll be publishing lists of critical medicines and the list of many therapeutic groups, as well as actual or potential shortages in the agency's website. So we'll also be gonna working on developing the electronic monitoring and reporting systems by initially establishing interim reporting tools for both industry and NCAs to collect the relevant data, primarily in the beginning through secure submissions, and later this year releasing strategic web form-based reporting systems that will also integrate product structure data. Regarding the development of the European shortage monitoring platform, we are now working, and we will actually go into more detail in the next slide on the platform legal provisions. We are now working on undertaking a feasibility study for which its objective is actually twofold. The first is to align on strategic direction on how to best deliver the platform, and second, to present a delivery proposal basically to the Mssg to initiate the discussion and planning on the technical specifications. So this is the European Shortage Monitoring Platform. So Article 13 of the regulation actually defines a new obligation indeed for the agency to set up, maintain, and manage this IT platform that will facilitate the collection of information on shortages, supply and demand of medicinal products, but also including information on marketing status and market cessation. So ultimately, the establishment of such a centralized platform will allow to report, monitor, and prevent medicine shortages, taking into account obviously the information that we'll receive from both MAHs and member states' single points of contact. So in the next slide, we'll basically digest a bit more Article 13 of the regulation to illustrate who should report the information through the platform to the EMA, and also what is the scope of the NCS and the industry's submissions. So here the scope is really monitoring, preventing and managing shortages, and these will take place under two particular scenarios. So scenario one in the blue box, this is what we call preparedness, and it concerns monitoring of shortages that can lead to public health emergencies or major events. So here the scope is really any actual or potential shortage of a medicine in a given member state that can lead to a major event or public health emergency. And it's important to highlight that this is actually different from the shortage routine monitoring that is undertaken at national level. Then we have scenario two. This is in the red box, and this concerns during crisis-specific situations like public health emergencies or major events. So here, the ESMP will collect data on shortages, including also other data of medicinal products that are on the critical medicines list, again, during a public health emergency or a major event. So for crisis-specific situations, as an example, we'll have the icebox of the MAGs expected to submit, again, amongst others, data on marketing status, shortages, and also, for example, available stocks or forecasts of demand. In addition to that, the medicine shortages stock working party will be expected to submit also, amongst others, data on demand, but also data on volumes of sales and prescription. So once fully functional, the ESMP basically is going to help us supporting the new structures and also operate both the medicine shortage stock working party and also the ISPOC network. In the next slide, we will be talking about in more detail what are the development requirements that are foreseen in the regulation to ensure the best use of the SMP. So in order to develop the ESMP, the agency in collaboration also with the Mssg has to establish and draw up a plan for the implementation of the platform. Here, the outcome of the feasibility study, as I mentioned before, will inform the agency's implementation plan. In addition to that, the EMA also has to develop the technical and functional specifications of the platform in collaboration with the Mssg in order to allow for the reporting of information from companies and member states. In addition to that, the agency also has to ensure that the submitted data is compliant with ISO standards and also based on sport domains, and also guarantee that any commercially confidential information is protected against unjustified disclosures. So the agency also needs to develop standardized reporting terminology and also guidance to industry and member states in collaboration with the Mssg, and finally ensure also data interoperability between the ESMP, the member states' IT systems, and also other relevant IT systems and databases, and making sure there's no duplication of reporting. We get now to the last part of the presentation. So in the next slide, we'll be talking about in more detail about the new role for the EMA on medical devices shortages. So here, the regulation, as mentioned before, also assigns new tasks to the EMA in monitoring and also mitigating potential and actual shortages of critical medical devices, but only in health emergencies. So here, the provisions on shortages of critical medical devices, as we mentioned before, will only apply from February 2023, and most of the legal provisions actually that apply to medical devices really mimic those that apply to medicines, obviously with the necessary adaptations to the medical devices sector. So here, the main difference is that the agency's role on medical devices shortages is exclusively to public health emergencies, so there's really no monitoring or preparedness activities for EMA during peacetime. Also in line with the medicine shortages, the agency is also tasked to set up a steering group to coordinate actions to mitigate supply issues of medical devices. This is the so-called EU Executive Steering Group on Shortages of Medical Devices. So from February next year, the MDSSG, how it is called, amongst others, will have a role on adopting lists of categories of critical medical devices, but also monitor supply of demand for medical devices. So here, also similarly to the shortage structures for medicines, also the steering group will be supported by a working party of SPOCs in the member states, but also a sub-network of SPOCs from economic operators, from medical device sector, and also notified bodies. So the next slide will also present a diagram of the MDSSG governance. So as you can see, very similarly to the MSSG, here the MDSSG will have a permanent composition, obviously with the necessary adaptations for the invited observers. So here we'll be gathering expert advice from representative of medical device interest groups and also notified bodies and manufacturers and other relevant actors from the medical device sector. In the next slide, we basically list what is expected from the supporting structures to the MDSSG. So here also single points of contact for industry and member states for medical devices shortage reporting. So here, very similarly to the medicine shortage structures, we have a working party with medical device shortage SPOCs consisting of member states representatives. Here the activities are exclusive to public health emergencies only, and the group is expected to report of estimated data on volumes of demand and also forecasts. Then we have the industry SPOC network that will consist of medical device manufacturers or their authorized representatives, as well as notified bodies and importers or distributors as appropriate. So according to a list of critical medical devices, this industry SPOC network will be established. Here, the responsibilities are again very much linked to a public health emergency only, and amongst the main reporting activities, we have the reporting of shortages, data on sales and market share and available stocks, also forecasts of demand and supply capacity, as well as prevention and mitigation plans. So in the next slide, we summarize now what type of preparatory work needs to be undertaken in 2022 by the EMA to basically enable the implementation of the mandate in the area of device shortages in 2023. So here, the implementation will have obviously to take into account the specificities for medical devices. So in this year, we'll be working towards establishing a drafting group that will support the activities within the preparatory phase. We'll also undertake preparatory work with a view of establishing the medical devices shortage steering group and also its supporting working party at the end of this year. We're also working now towards identifying the sources of information for critical medical devices currently in the absence of EUDAMED, and also we are putting most of our focus on establishing the interactions with existing groups that are responsible for medical devices and a national competent authority. So we're going to be working towards that during this year, and in particular also developing and creating relationships with key medical devices stakeholders in order to develop this strategy to be compliant and fulfill the reporting requirements. So this basically concludes my presentation. However, I'd like to quickly summarize in the next slide the main points. So as we've mentioned, the new mandate provides the tools to prevent shortages of medicines and also ensure supply during public health emergencies, and for the very first time also extend the monitoring to devices during public health emergencies. So 2022 will actually be a very busy year for the agency, working on the process and also the tools to enable and be compliant with the new regulation, primarily on the chapter for medicine shortages, which became already applicable on the 1st of March. So currently, we're really working on transitioning from the pre-pandemic ad hoc structures and processes put in place also at the start of the pandemic to those foreseen in the regulation in order to try to make them more robust. Also, we are, as we've mentioned, starting the preparatory work to ensure a smooth and efficient delivery of the ESMP by early 2025. And here on the platform front, we'll be continuously engaging also actively with stakeholders towards the delivery of a minimum viable product that will meet the regulation provisions, but also stakeholder needs. And finally, for critical medical devices, most of the preparatory work is ongoing to set up the necessary structures and processes by the 2nd of February next year. So here we'll also be, as we mentioned, establishing the necessary interactions and also relationships with authorities and stakeholders in the field of medical devices. So I'll stop here. Thanks very much for listening. So I'll hand over now back to the co-chairs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, João, for that very clear presentation. I would like to inform all participants and also those that are following us through the live broadcast that this presentation, together with the recording of this session, will be published in the EMA website. Now, I would like to see whether my co-chair, we can hear my co-chair, so I would give them the floor to introduce the panelists for today's session. Carl?
So, Monica, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's a pleasure for me to welcome you here to this session as well. And as you heard already by João, Monica and I will be working closely together in the months and years to come to deliver on the roles and responsibilities set out in the new regulation in the area of shortages. I think for the Mssg, it is very important that it has a steering role, and therefore I'm happy that many heads of agencies are members of the Mssg, as it will work out only efficiently when we work together. And this is one of the key messages from our lessons learned in the EMRN. So after now, João, thank you very much for this clear presentation and summarizing all the details which are in front of us. Now we have today a rich alignment of panelists to support our discussion and answer your questions to it. I will now invite each of them to briefly introduce themselves, and starting with Sylvain.
Carl, thank you very much, Monica. Thank you for inviting me to join this conversation from DG Health and Food Safety, the European Commission. I'm the head of unit medical products in this DG, and today in this panel on shortages, I'd like to bring maybe briefly some background information on how we've come to this mandate extension. Most of you would know, but from the early days of the crisis with respect to shortages, the Commission and EMA and the national authorities actually have been working very much together in a collaborative way, establishing tools and ad hoc processes to react to the emergency situation. A certain number of these have proven quite efficient, in providing the coordinated response that we needed to pose preventively and reactively to the challenges we had, and in particular the challenges related to shortages. And therefore, when the Commission proposed the proposal that ultimately became the regulation that we are talking about today, what we had in mind is that when we were still in the middle of the pandemic at that time, what we had in mind is to ensure that we could establish further this coordination and codify a certain number of the practices and mechanisms that had been put in place and that had shown a certain usefulness. So this primarily meant to reinforce the role of the agency and the network of national authorities in the way they work on shortages and the way they can improve and build capacity to go one step further into the coordination and the preparedness. This was supported by the co-legislatures and ended up in the form of the regulation that we are talking about today. This now very much complements and further develops the tasks that the agency has already had in the funding regulation and the practices and activities, with a focus on preventing and mitigating potential and actual shortages. So, if you allow me for another few inputs as we're starting, and we can come back to that, I'd like to highlight a few important elements from this regulation. First is that it is lessons learned, and I used the word codifying. It is about that. It is about codifying. It is about lessons learned. It is about, but it is also about establishing a new system. First thing. Second thing, that it's about crisis management, it's about emergency action, but it is also about preparedness. And to be able to manage the crisis, to have the tools, the appropriate tools in place in times of crisis, we need also some structural changes to our work, and we need to put in place a certain number of structural tools in place. This is what is very well reflected in the use of the words in the regulation, the potential and actual shortages, and also prevent and mitigate. This idea that this is about crisis, but it is also about peacetime. Joao used this expression and explained very well these different elements. It's also about teamwork, teamwork across, teamwork at EU level between agencies, and this was between agencies and the Commission. This was highlighted in the previous session. It's about cooperation, it's about working together, but it is also about clear allocation of tasks and responsibilities and empowerment of each of the different players at EU level. It's also about teamwork between the EU level and the national level. And the core place for that is the medicines shortages steering group, and actually also the medical devices shortages steering group for that matter. So we talk a lot about the EMA mandate extension, and this is what this regulation is about. But of course, when we say the EMA mandate extension, we should all understand and realize, and I'm sure Carl and the other colleagues from the national authorities will highlight that, we should all understand and realize that it implies also a reinforced role and a reinforced cooperation and reinforced capacities for the national agencies to work together and to input into that process beyond what the EMA itself is going to do. And last,
thanks, Sylvain.
One second and I finish. Last but not least, and a very important element in that conversation is the need to generate data and knowledge. We already talked about this, and I would like that we have the opportunity to come back to this in the next few in the rest of this conversation in the panel. Thank you very much. I apologize for being too long.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvain. We planned it only 10 minutes for this first round to have time then for the discussion. So I asked your followers to be short with an introduction. So we will follow up now with Thierry, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for EMA to give me the opportunity to speak today about shortages of medical device. So I'm Thierry Sirdet. I work for the French competent authorities for medicinal product and healthcare product, and I am director of the Department for Medical Device and IVD product. Obviously, very briefly, it's a very important question of to manage shortage of medical device, not only in emergency situation, but I think too in the normal time and peacetime. Obviously, it's a new field of interest for competent authority because we are in front of an open market and a wide range of product in which cover all sectors of the industry. So we have to put in place a process. We have to define what is a critical medical device and if a critical medical device could be exist. And we have a lot of work to done to allow this European coordination needed. And we saw the need of this kind of coordination during the last COVID crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Thierry, and we will follow up with Darren, please.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to be brief. My name's Darren. I manage the medicine shortages team in the Irish Medicines Competent Authority, and as has been described most of today, the crisis the pandemic has really put into perspective and kind of given us an organic development of where we are today. And from our perspective, the three key pillars are the communication, coordination, and cooperation, which is fundamental to the mandate extension. Thanks, Carl.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. So we can then go on with Marco, please.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you, everyone, also for inviting me to speak today. So I'll also be brief. Marco Farinelli. I am the chair of the Supply Chain Working Group in FBIA, and I work in the global supply chain of AstraZeneca. Just allow me maybe to raise three quick points for the discussion, which I believe are interesting. We are talking about developing an ambitious system. We want to develop it as best. And I think there are three elements that require consideration. One is the system's internal consistency. So avoiding to have a piecemeal approach on that, avoiding data redundancy, potentially submitting the same data through different channels, because that would pretty much weaken internal consistency of the system and then the use of the system. We have spoken about interoperability, which is a key factor. We need a common language for that interoperability. So that's an important point, I think, to be discussed. SPORE IDMP elements of that are an important common language that allows us to interconnect different systems, because there is a lot of information in neighboring systems. We believe in different files when it comes to supply, more information on supply chain, like the market authorization, GMP files. A lot of information can be found there. So simply gathering that information will provide us health of the work done in a way. And the final point is working with the future in mind. We have talked about shortage prevention plans. These are very important for critical medicines. There will be more and more of these. And of course, this also provides data, supply chain data into the pot. So it's important that we already sort of have the future in mind in terms of how are we going to connect this data and information coming in as we move on with the project and we develop more and more shortage prevention plans for critical medicines, as this information gets into EMA or national competent authorities. So we also need to think of the future in mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Marco. And please, Adrian, you can follow.
Thank you very much. I'll just raise a couple of key points. I really want to underline that I 100% agree with Sylvain on the need for a new structural approach, learning from the lessons of COVID. And here I refer specifically to the ISPOC experience, where we had a non-harmonized approach to the collection of data, and that did not work. So we cannot repeat what did not work. I need to underline here that today and in the future, almost all shortage reporting is done nationally and will continue to be done nationally to national agencies. So the key is to align on common definition and standards nationally so the data can be shared and readable cross-border between France and Germany, between Poland and the Netherlands. This is what really, really matters here. So we need to agree what are the operational points that need to be reported digitally, what are standards around issues like the duration of the shortage, the criticality to patients, how do we align this data so that it's readable cross-border, and how do we create this interoperable IT system so all of this national data can be shared cross-border at a European level. This is absolutely critical. And I must say, I'm a little bit concerned about what I just saw in terms of different processes and what looked to be different systems for both within medicines and across medicines and medical devices where you may have combined products or combined issues. So I think we need to have another discussion to make sure that in the end, the regulatory agencies, the whole of the EU, each member state can have usable, readable data from this system. I'm quite concerned about, I'm afraid, what was presented, and I think we need to rediscuss that because we want to move towards simple and usable data, not additional complexity. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian, for these comments and concerns. We will come back to that. And please now, Jesus.
Thank you so much, Carl. I think I echo some of the concerns from Adrian and also some of the great points that have been made by the other panelists. There are two aspects that I would like to quickly highlight, though. One is the fact that collecting data from industry and manufacturers on shortages only tells half the story. We have seen throughout the pandemic situations where manufacturers themselves were providing materials and products into the market sufficient to meet the demand. So that was being done. But nevertheless, there were major shortages at the level of hospitals. So it is actually, at least in the device field, important to understand that if your only data input comes from manufacturers, you're going to miss some potential shortages at the level of hospitals because of distribution inefficiencies and other problems that do arise. So that's something that to take into account because those are critical situations where patients are impacted directly. The other thing I would say is that it's all well and good to collect all this data and monitor how shortages are coming along and so on, but it's really important to keep in mind the next step. So what happens next with the data that you collect when you realize a shortage is coming? Who is going to react and how is that going to happen? It's important to understand that in this situation, the Medicines Agency is not acting on its own. There will be work also from HERA, from other agencies, from member states, and it's necessary to understand how the monitoring work at the level of the agency is going to plug into the mechanisms that can then be triggered to address the shortages. So I think both of these aspects, could benefit from further discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Jesus, for this. And today, Hilmar Hammann will not be available, but his colleague Alexandra will take over. Please, Alexandra.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Alexandra Dacic, and I'm head of department in EMA Information Management Division that mainly collaborates with internal and external stakeholders on delivery of extensive technology portfolio. So now having in mind that extended mandate and specifically the topics around the medicine shortages and medical devices shortages, counts on number of tools and technology platforms to facilitate these enhanced and new processes. I'm here today with you to answer the questions or support the panelists and have a good discussion on how we can collaborate in order to create something that is good and useful for all the participants in the process.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra. For these introductory then statements, and before we open now the floor to the various stakeholders, representatives who have been invited to join us here in the virtual WebEx room, I would like to invite all of you to, following the meeting, to use this session to share your views on what should be priorities in the implementation process and how stakeholders should be involved. You can use the Slido, as you know, and use again then EMA extended mandate for this. And we have already heard some concerns, and with that I hand over to Monica again, and then we will start with the panelists in the virtual room. Please, Monica.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carl. Just to say that within the virtual room, we have representatives from patients, consumers, healthcare professionals, pharmaceutical industry, academics, national and international competent authorities. So I would ask you please to raise your hand to take the microphone and speak. And when you're speaking, we encourage everyone to turn on their cameras so that we can make this discussion more interactive. Along with oral interventions, participants in the WebEx room can also type their questions in the chat box. And we have already a wealth of questions within the chat box. So I would ask the colleagues in the web room to please raise your hand so that we can give you the floor so that you can ask your questions. You will need to raise your hand so that we can give you the floor. I think we have a question from Jurate.
So actually, thank you very much for the presentation, and we heard a lot of calls for cooperation, collaboration, etc. So we hope that also there is a willingness to collaborate and cooperate with the industry. We are ready to do our share. And I actually have a question, and maybe this is actually to João, is to ask. You talked a lot about the systems, etc. One of the first things that you have to deliver is the list. So we just want to have a bit more details how you will actually work on that to deliver it by August, and if there will be any opportunities to engage on that, I mean, on behalf of the industry, because we think we have also valuable insights and what we can bring to the table. And also, I mean, not forgetting the work we have done last year on the structured dialogue and some of the things working on sort of the criteria for criticality, whether that is going to be picked up or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Jurate. So I will now ask perhaps João to answer your questions. And João, if you could please clarify the difference between the various lists, I think that would be helpful for Jurate and other colleagues online. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Monica. Thanks, Jurate, for the question. So indeed, I mean, I think it's very important to distinguish that we're talking about two sets of lists. So the first one is the list of what we call the main therapeutic groups. And here, the scope is very much about gathering therapeutic groups of scientific disciplines or medical disciplines that concern intensive, surgical, and emergency care use. So products that are primarily of hospital care use. So this is something that has, according to the legislation, to be delivered by the 2nd of August. So this is a list of main therapeutic groups that will be primarily developed in cooperation with the Medicine Shortages SPOC Working Party, and also together with the support from representatives from the healthcare professionals and patients and consumers working parties, because they have a seat at the level of the Mssg, and we will rely also on the clinical expertise to inform the preparation of this list of main therapeutic groups. So this is one type of list. Then the second type of list is what we call the crisis-specific list. So this can either be a list of critical medicines for a major event or a list of critical medicines for public health emergency. And here we do not have any legal deadlines established in the regulation, but we need to come up with this list of critical medicines for, particularly for current pandemic, as soon as possible. So here, again, if you would like to have more details on the methodology here, we're also going to be consulting primarily the Medicine Shortages SPOC Working Party, because the substances that need to be put together for that list of critical COVID-19 medicines have to also be learned from the experience that member states have at national level. So this is going to be a very important contributor on defining the substances for the list of critical COVID-19 medicines from the member states, together also with the support from the patients and healthcare professionals working parties. Now, indeed, it is foreseen that from a methodological point of view, we can also consult, and we will also consult for a list of critical medicines for both major events and public health emergencies, also industry stakeholders. And this is actually something that is foreseen in the regulations. So as part of the review process, indeed, industry stakeholders can be invited to review the list as appropriate. So I wanted to also reassure you of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron. Yurati, I hope your question was answered. And just perhaps to also highlight that there is the third list that you're referring to, the list of critical medicines, both peacetime and crisis. This was the started development under the structured dialogue part of the European Commission pharmaceutical strategy, and that is not really foreseen in the regulation, in this regulation and the extended mandate of EMA. So I believe that we have also a hand up from José Drabuel. Please, would you like to take the floor?
Thank you very much for this very interesting information, although I am suffering a bit from information overload at the moment. However, I just wanted to mention that IPOPI represents a patient group for primary immunodeficiency. And as already has been mentioned by Ulrich Jäger, that there is a severe shortage of immunoglobulin. And I'm a little concerned, or rather concerned, how quickly this critical shortage can be resolved, because by all the different ways that you have described, it will still take a very long time before there is an actual positive result to collect more plasma. Now, I think more investment is needed as well, because during the pandemic, it was possible to collect convalescent plasma because there was an investment from the EU in order to facilitate this. So we need to continue to implement this type of system to collect more plasma very urgently, because patients are losing their lives. So maybe Yao can perhaps give me an answer on how quickly we can reverse the situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. I will perhaps ask Darren to take the floor here. I think he might also help with your question on the immunoglobulins, Darren.
Thanks, Monica, and thanks for the question. The immunoglobulins, as you pointed out, is a pretty significant issue for patients. And one of the key things to understand is also, and I'm sure that it doesn't go unseen, that it is a complex, because of the manufacturing process, it's complex. So it's not something that can be turned around very quickly. Within the context of for example, the SPOC working group are doing is this has been on our agenda for some time now, trying to understand across different member states what's the issue in terms of their particular situation, the donations, the interactions with all of the companies, excuse me, to try and come up with an identification on how we try and facilitate easing the barriers, for example, to donations and things like that. Some of our member state colleagues have initiated some in-depth, detailed surveys to try and understand other causes outside of a medicine shortages, as in dealing with the specific shortage, to try and fundamentally understand root causes, so that not only does the acute situation at the moment try to be identified and resolved, but also the broader fundamental reliances and dependencies that are there. It's interesting that the situation with immunoglobulins, it might not be something that comes under a direct list that could be seen for ICU and the way the mandate has been developed, but because of a consequence of the situation with the pandemic, the donations obviously have reduced across different countries. Excuse me. And then therefore that's I suppose a different way and how that gets to come into our challenges in terms of trying to react to it to get patients treated. With the acute situation, there's a lot of interaction with healthcare professionals as well as industry to try and understand what mitigation, what alternative products can be used, and how you triage, let's say, the patients that most need those immunoglobulins, and to try and target to get the products to those in the first instance, whilst the other patients are managed through potentially alternative mechanisms. I go back, it's a difficult question that I can't answer in a very quick way. As you know, it's a very challenging supply network. It's fundamentally reliant on donations usually. So it's an excellent question. It's a challenging approach, but I hope I've tried to illustrate a lot of the different work that's happened during the last 2 years. It is something that's on our agenda every month on how to deal with it, and there's a lot of activity, and it's not just member states. And this goes to other questions that maybe have been raised with industry relationship. It's a multi-stakeholder approach. Even if it's the NCAs that might be doing it, it's all collective across the European member states, the EMA, and in industry representatives at a European level, as well as patients and healthcare professionals. So it's to try and get a holistic perspective on what the issues are, to be able to try and identify the solutions in specific instances such as this.
Okay, thank you. Then my next question is, because if a lot of patients do not get their immunoglobulin, they will end up in ICU. And what happens then? Will it then become a medicine that will need urgent care?
Trying to look around the corner to understand, well, what's the next issue is a challenge for us all, right? I suppose, just to be clear, I'm not saying it's not a critical product. I'm saying that it is part of what we are looking at. It's one of those tangential impacts that you don't necessarily see until it actually starts to happen. But your point is well made. It is those patients potentially will move on to ICU, and it is something that that is taken into account. And that's where, again, it goes back to understanding from a health system perspective. And again, it goes back to the three things I said: the coordination, cooperation, communication. We need to understand from a health systems perspective, what is the impact if patient does not get the medicine, and how do we then translate that into trying to have a meaningful discussion with the other stakeholders to solve the issues.
Thank you so much, Darren, for that very, very thorough answer, and also for providing information on the work that we are doing within the SPOC working party on immunoglobulins. So I have next with a hand up, Mary McCarthy. Would you like please to take the floor and put the question to the panelists?
Thank you. Yeah, my question really was that I applaud the initiative that is talking about a common European portal where shortages and ways to mitigate these can be registered. But to do this, we need certain structural things in place first. We need to have good coverage of IT. We need to have robust IT with proper speeds, but we also need to have consistent and reliable coding throughout the different member states. And I think that this is something that should be investigated. Are we all using the same codes in the same way? Is the information being put in by medical professionals or by administrative staff? Because these may have different priorities and may input data in a slightly different way. And certainly I have found in my own area that information that is put in by family doctors, general practitioners, is different from that put in by hospital staff, who are often administrative staff and put in the information because of the tariff coding or for some other non-clinical reason. It would be good to see some sort of unified system across the EU which would try to ensure that this is reliable and consistent coding. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for that question. I'm not sure whether we can comment on data inputted in hospitals and also at the level of community pharmacies, but certainly Alexandra can give you an overview of what we're doing within the European Medicines Regulatory Network. Alexandra, would you be able to take this question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for the question, Mary. It's a really, really good point because unless we use the same standard and unless the whole Europe talks the same language when we talk about the product, then none of this, collaboration between the systems and some meaningful insight cannot be made. So legislation is also very clear that we should rely on ISO. So idea is really to utilize what was done in the previous year with the SPORE, and specifically talking about product management system implementation and the working on the data quality for the products, as well as organizations and referentials. And this would be the way to follow the same standard and to ensure that when we collect the data that João was explaining extensively through which groups, that this is something that we can consolidate, report on it, make an insight from it, and exchange in an easy way back with the relevant parties. And, you know, legislation is also mentioning that we should not increase the administration, not to repeat the, you know, inputs of the data. So, of course, that we will be looking on what is already out there. We've been mentioning feasibility study. That's exactly the initiative that EMA is doing currently, looking at what are the solutions that are already there, implemented, like European Medicine Verification System, maybe some local initiatives. I understand that there will be some joint activities from the MSGs on this. So absolutely, the idea is not to do this in isolation, but to benefit from what have been done so far in the previous years, try to implement the standards so that we can all speak the same language between our local and European systems.
Thank you very much, Alexandra.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, Mary, as well for your question. And now we have Ansela Santos. Would you like to take the floor, please?
Yes, thank you. Wait, I'll start the video. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to ask something for clarification, because when João, so when you gave your presentation, you mentioned that in April you will establish the list, so the methodology, no, for establishing these lists of critical medicines. And then now in your last intervention, my understanding is that the PCWP will be consulted in these processes. So I would like to know a bit more about the timeline, because if this is going to be developed in April, does it mean that we're going to receive something in the next month to comment on, or just wanted to ask for clarification? Thank you.
Thank you, João. Over to you.
Yes, and thanks, Angela, for the question. So that's absolutely right. So in the course of April, we are going to continue with the work towards developing and adopting this list of critical medicines for COVID-19 in May by the Mssg. So this is some work that's going to be also undertaken in consultation, as I mentioned before, with the Emergency Task Force, so the ETF. So this is something that we're working towards drafting and developing in the course of April. So indeed, as part of the stakeholder interactions, the patients and consumers, patients and healthcare professionals, working parties are going to be consulted towards the review of the list of critical COVID-19 medicine. This will happen certainly in April, as I mentioned, towards again the adoption of the list later in May by the Mssg. So indeed, I mean, we'll try to take the benefit of the fact that indeed, as part of the Mssg permanent representation, we have representatives from PCWP and HCPWP. So we will use those representatives indeed to trigger the written consultations of that particular list of critical COVID-19 medicines. Yeah.
Thank you, João. And the next the next person to give the floor is to Dominika Mitzela.
Yes, good morning. Dominika Mitzela from the Plasma Protein Therapeutics Association. We represent the private manufacturers and collectors of plasma-derived medicines. And this is because I want to tag on to what Ulrich Jäger and Josie Drabble have said. For considering that immunoglobulin shortages have been raised as part of this meeting, and on several occasions, we as industry certainly want to offer our collaboration in all the areas that you have mentioned. We would like to again emphasize that one of the key issues with access to PDMPs is the shortage of plasma being collected in Europe. And certainly what we would want to emphasize, it is critical that EMA and any other stakeholders involves patients as well as industry in any decision making, because simply if the active material to manufacture immunoglobulins and other PDMPs is not collected or not present in Europe, shortages cannot be mitigated. So certainly we as an industry, we would like to offer our collaboration and participation, and also much has said about utilization of existing systems for shortage monitoring and mitigation. We as industry, we do have our own data program to allow patients and any other stakeholders to view which products are available in which European region, as well as in the US. So we can certainly offer to share our system with you. So certainly willing to collaborate with all stakeholders in this exercise. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominika, for offering your support. I don't know, Darren, whether you would like to perhaps respond to Dominika or add any other point.
Thanks, Monica. To Dominika, thank you for the point. It's well made, and we do know that there's been interactions with the likes of the industry, like yourselves. I was actually going to make a point on it was a complementary point to Zhao's response, which is relating to the medicines. And the level of interaction with the different stakeholders. I just want to point out that when the NCAs in the SPOC working group are looking at the critical medicines, it's not done in a vacuum. It's done within the context of the health system. So there is a close cooperation and collaboration between the NCAs and the health system. So that involves patients and healthcare professionals in order to identify what are the important medicines, which then goes into part of the SPOC working group, which then develops the medicines list. And then there's a supranational consultation through the mechanisms that Zhao has said. I just wanted to add that just to tie it in, because I've seen a few questions and points relating to getting the different views and the different stakeholders' points across, and they're all very valid. And just to say that does happen, and it's coordinated through the SPOC working group and up into then the Mssg. Thanks. And then Dominika, if there's anything else that you needed me to respond to, I'm sorry.
No, I think this is it. I think we certainly appreciate the assurance that that industry will be involved in the decision making, as we have pointed out. It is we do represent a specific sector that requires specific considerations, and as Josie and others have pointed out, it cannot be done without. So we certainly appreciate that assurance. Thank you.
Exactly, it's not done in isolation. And then I would also say, and it's to a point that had been made earlier, we're not reinventing any wheels here. What we're trying to do is build on lessons learned that we have all experienced throughout the last 2 years, and that includes the interaction with all the different stakeholders. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Darren, for that further clarification on the process for establishing the list of critical medicines. And I think that's what the information you just provided, I think perhaps is not necessarily obvious to everyone. So thank you. And conscious of the time, so I'll move to the next person that raised their hand, was Sabrina Conti. Would you like to put your question? Well, while we wait for Sabrina to connect and so that we can take a question, I propose that we give the floor now to Adrian van Oven.
Thank you very much. So just in reference to the EMA slides, I noticed for the crisis committee, the crisis committee, there were 2 issues written down there. One was that the industry should provide demand projections, I suppose, for surge demand in a crisis. And my question here is, of course, FP and Medicines for Europe, we led a special project under the surveillance of DG Santé and DG Competition to do this on ICU medicines during COVID. But this was because the ECDC didn't have a mandate to produce 3 to 6 months predictions. But it is my understanding that with the new mandate, ECDC can make these longer, let's say, industry valuable predictions. A second point, as I mentioned, there's a lot in there about production capacity, but in reality, in a crisis, this is not the relevant information. The relevant information is allocation. And the reason for this is because for ICU medicines, for example, what was done was we increased the output. What that means is the speed of production. You add a third shift to your factory and you can produce faster. You don't change your production capacity, but you produce faster to meet the surge. When it came to the vaccines, what they had to do was add a bunch of contract manufacturers. And here again, it's about allocation. It's not what is the capacity of those contract manufacturers, but how quickly can you tech transfer? How quickly can you increase biologic yield? And how quickly then can you allocate the stock to the EU? So I think really we need to discuss these 2 points and if how we do this in the most efficient way, again, based on the lessons learned from COVID.
Thank you, Adrian. And I believe the regulation mentions both production capacity as supply capacity. But I'll give the floor to João so they can address your question. João, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Adrian. So indeed, so basically the legal provisions are indeed quite clear when it comes to the reporting requirements by industry. So here we're talking about a wealth of data that indeed has to be submitted by both member states and pharmaceutical companies. So for pharmaceutical companies, primarily, we're talking about not only information on shortages, but we're talking also about information on available stocks, also shortage and mitigation and prevention plans, as well as we're just discussing supply capacity and production capacity. So indeed, that information is captured in the regulation, and obviously now that we are working towards defining the right way to basically collect that information from industry, we know which are the requirements, but we will also want to work with industry towards understanding how can we facilitate best the collection of this type of data. So what we envision also at this stage is that because we are now working towards deploying a set of solutions for industry to report that information to us. So you may be well aware about the as-is ICE-POC system that was initially deployed in the beginning of the pandemic, and for which obviously we knew that it was not the optimal system, but it was the system that we could come up with due to the urgency of the situation at the beginning of the pandemic. So we're now fully replacing those systems that rely on emails with attached Excel files by more secure type of submissions. Now, for these type of reporting systems that we have to develop before the ESMP becomes fully functional, I think it's critical for us also to involve and engage also with industry trade associations and also primarily with those companies that have an experience also with the use of the system. So we want to engage and we want to understand how to collect also best that information, provided that the information is also in line with the reporting obligations that the regulation tells us about. So indeed, I mean, we plan to have a few targeted consultations with companies in order to consult them at the level of the reporting requirements. So if there are concerns about how to collect best data when it comes to production and supply capacity, we want to work together also with companies in order to optimize and to understand best how to get that information reported through the necessary web form. So this is something we're going to be looking at in the coming months. So interacting continuously also with companies and with industry trade associations in order to get this also job done right. So yeah, I think that's my immediate reaction for now. Thanks.
Ciao, just if I can just respond to this, being very concrete. In a crisis situation where there's a demand surge, what matters? How many vials my factory can produce a year, or how many vials we can get to Germany, Poland, France, the Netherlands, etc. I think this is really the question. I think we really need to move from reading the law and very theoretical considerations to the practical ones of when are we getting the medicines to the patients. And I think we need to move beyond this theoretical discussions.
Thank you, Adrian, for your comments. So I will try to see whether we can bring back Sabrina Conti and connect her so that she can put a question.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. Now you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
I was not able to unmute myself because of the control system. So thanks. During the presentation, it was mentioned that there will be for the platform an interim system. So we know that the platform should be fully operational by 2025. So I would like to understand better what we mean by an interim system, and also if it's part of the feasibility study to understand understand if the sport terminology that it's there can be already used to have, even it's in a stepwise approach, sport can be easily interoperable quickly. Thanks.
Thank you, Sabrina. I give the floor to Alexandra.
I'm sorry, Monica, maybe some of other panelists can help me out with this one.
João, would you like to answer Sabrina?
Yes, so I'll start with a reference to the tactical or the interim solution. So this is something that we are working now at the moment. So basically, as I mentioned before, so we currently aim to replace fully the systems that rely on industry reporting that have a particular format that relies on emails and Excels that are attached to those submissions. So we really want to replace those type of submission formats in order to be compliant with the regulation provisions that concern information security and the data confidentiality aspect. So we are now towards getting that particular tactical solution that relies on secure submissions deployed by the agency during June. So this is something that's part of our priorities. But again, this is just a tactical solution. This will not be the long-term strategic solution, because indeed we want to move away fully from those submissions that rely on Excel uploads, and we want to indeed have, from a user friendliness perspective, indeed web forms that have addressed all these product data integration concerns that a few colleagues have already raised today. So this is what we're going to be looking at. So in the first stage, getting those interim solutions deployed by June, and when we work towards the end of the year, indeed have these sort of more permanent web forms that are going to be indeed the pillar also for the minimum viable product of the ESMP in the long term. So this is a lot of work that we're working towards the IT front. So when it comes to also the strategic web forms, indeed, I mean, this will have to be compliant with ISO standards, and also have into account the sport domains as we've just also appointed to before. So I think this is for now, Monica. My question, I don't know if Alexander now you'd like
Just
also
maybe to add more on now tactically how we will approach it gradually to ensure the secure submission, but then on more a general note, recently Executive Board of EMA has endorsed a new EMA information security strategy for the next 5 years, which really outlines the agency's strategic approach to information security for the next period as an important milestone to demonstrate the commitment of protecting the information asset and the business processes, and to continuously improve the maturity level of information security while supporting these new business and technology challenges. Current crisis is also urging us to closely monitor the IT environment, and we are following the recommendations from the European Union to increase this cybersecurity level. So it's absolutely right that whatever new we are implementing, we really have this in our mind that it has to be done in a secure way, and also in mind to have the Sensitive Data Protection Act.
Thank you both for answering this question. And I'm afraid that we have to now move on to the next part of our agenda. So for that, I will hand over now, give the floor to Fergus. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Monica, and everyone. That was really lively. So we're going to display the points on the slide. But just before I switch there, I've seen a few questions in the chat. One on AMR, one on medication errors, and another on the more strategic robustness of the EU manufacturing. So perhaps to emphasize, particularly for AMR and medication errors, that clearly these are key priorities for the European network, but not specifically addressed by this mandate. And to remind everybody that this new mandate sits inside and interacts with the CHMP, the PRAC, the Medicines Regulatory Network, and all the other things that the medicines agencies are doing. So these other priorities are nonetheless very strongly addressed. But perhaps but not specifically the topic of this mandate, and they will come back in other discussions and significant initiatives. If you could look to the European Medicines Agency's network strategy to 2025, you can see clear focus on that. So if nonetheless I ask colleagues to display the Slido, we have input, I think really reflecting the discussions we've just had. So I'll just go down the aspects and then perhaps hand back to Monica if one or other of your panel felt wanting, or yourself or Carl to react on any of these points. But really a lot of emphasis on standardized reporting terminology and guidance and coding across the member states. And I think for building ESMP, the terminology and the coding is going to be really important, and that comes up in the next point again. Harmonized data fields include all supply chain stakeholders. So we need to make sure that all those who need to be involved have a clear understanding of the standards. And Alexandra has referred earlier to the ISO IDMP, and there is a lot of standard terminology already established and being built into the network. So I think we've got the building blocks there. We just need to make sure we focus on and use those that are essential to this process. Involving patient organizations and healthcare professionals is key. I think we want to really make sure we continue that dialogue with you, and your presence in both the ETF as members and observers in the MSSG will be a key point in ensuring that the concerns of these wide community, who in the end are the real users of medicines, are being taken into account. Clear reporting instructions and criteria in routine mode as well as crisis mode. Obviously, the plasma industry, there are various particular types of medicines and supply chains for different sorts of medicines, which have their specificities and they need to be carefully taken into account. And we've been watching this very closely during the COVID crisis. I think we will continue to fast track on critical shortages. Clearly, the veterinary area will become involved where applicable, and there are references out to the veterinary area, but this legislation in itself focuses on human medicines, but there are clearly interactions and cross dependencies in a variety of situations. Common standards, again, shouldn't be a separate way for different types of products. Yes, we'll have common pathways for products and scrolling down. And I think from Francois, your orders defining information needs for patients, I think is, how do we feed back to patients and indeed to healthcare professionals on shortages and alternative medicines where that becomes necessary and how to deal with that. So I think keeping going. So a lot of shortage reporting is clearly coming through national level, but the advantage of this now is we're bringing all this together to a single common set of information that we can use in a collective manner. Governance and responsibilities are important. One health approach. Keep going down because there are cross dependencies in supply chains. So I think, you may want to comment, Monica, on the industry interaction with MSSG, but I think there are clear provisions in the legislation for the MSSG to invite the different parties for discussions, whether it's a specific company or industry or more generally. So I think that brings us close to the bottom then. Is there anything? So global mitigation strategy, I think it's important to emphasize that in the regulation, it gives us also the role to reach out internationally and discuss with our international partners in the different platforms that apply. And this is something that has been ongoing right throughout the crisis, and we will continue to do that. Finding creative alternatives is always part of the agenda. So I think probably I should hand over back to Monica now to to wrap.
Thank you.
Want to wrap up?
Yes.
Just a lot
Thank
more.
you, Fergus. Actually, Carl will do the wrap up. I just want to perhaps say from my perspective that the session was very helpful because it provided us really insight on the views and concerns of the stakeholders. And I think that is essential for us to engage with stakeholders, essential to ensure a successful implementation of the regulation, which is ultimately all that we want. And I think one important or two important points came up. One is data, importance of data, and we addressed that question during the discussions. Another important aspect to me that was raised is the importance of having all stakeholders involved, both during the preparatory activities for early signal of shortages, for instance, and during crisis as well, and in particular in the development of lists of critical medicines. Just to reiterate, this is foreseen in the regulation, and we will engage with stakeholders and we will reach out to all in order to develop those lists of critical medicines. And last but not least, communication. I think clear and timely communication to patients and healthcare professionals is very important as well, and I think that was highlighted. But I would like to now give the floor to Carl to do the formal wrap up for this session. Carl, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Monica. So I only can echo what you have already said. So I think we made clear that we have to distinguish between the crisis time and the peace time. And then we have to address in the different settings the criticality. We have the main therapeutic groups list and the crisis specific list, and clarified what is seen in these lists. I think harmonization, interoperability, data protection, of course, is key to the shortages monitoring system. And then the close relationship between us as regulators and all stakeholders involved is important key here to take the lessons learned from the COVID situation. And of course, we will take into consideration the comments already done by industry on the demand projections, production allocation, and how we can deal with that in a dynamic way in a crisis situation. So thank you very much to all the panelists, and with that, back to Fergus.
So thank you very much, Carl, Monica, and all the panelists. So now we're going to break for lunch. We will be back promptly at 12:50, so at 10 to the hour, for our next session, which is on the emergency task force. So thank you all. Have a good break, but be back promptly at 12:50. Thank you.